Hi. Thank you so much to Digital Garage for having me. I feel like I'm going to give you something a little bit different today. I don't work in industry. I don't develop technology. So in some sense, I might be maybe slightly useless, but I hope I have something to share with you today. Are my slides up? They are. They're not here or up there either. Oh, they're behind me, but just behind me. Great. So you can see my name. I'm Ashley Shu at vt.edu. I teach on issues of philosophy of technology, which is my interest area. And I'm going to tell you a bit about augmented humans today, which is to say that we exist. Right? So augmentation is already here, if you don't believe that from some of the earlier speakers. I also want to tell you that augmented humans sometimes have different ideas about the technologies that are applied to their bodies than the designers do. Nope. All right. Oh, there we go. So the poet and author Gillian Weiss writes, "For a while, all the experts on African Americans were white. All the experts on lesbians were Richard von Krafft-Ebing, and all the experts on cyborgs were non-interfaced humans." So I want to tell you a story about augmented humans already existing, and by and large, augmented humans are sick and disabled people. So when I think about my own journey into being an augmented human, and certainly what you can tell right now is that my leg is not completely, it's not all meat. I actually first got an implant right there. I don't know if you can hear it making noise. That allows people to put needles in my body in a way that won't burn up my peripheral veins. It allows me to get higher dosages of chemo for the bone cancer that I had. I keep it still because it's much easier to get blood draws and to have maintained. I just have to go in every 2 months and get it flushed. So the maintenance procedures aren't hard for this. The sort of people who already have these devices, of course, are not particularly healthy people. What I'm interested in today is actually disabled people, which I think is a different category than sick people. Sometimes these overlap, like in my case, being a cyborg for several reasons, being an augmented human. And Gillian Weiss, the poet who I just referred to, talks about having some sort of fundamental interface as important to being augmented in some way. So yes, you can wear tons of wearables, but they wear off at the end of the day. You get to role play for a moment and then change it up. So my plan for this presentation is to talk a bit about the ideas people have about disability, which is to say the biases people have against disabled people. To talk about, after that, some sort of engineering approaches to disability, particularly the medical model that has been identified by disability studies scholars, and then to talk about user and community approaches to disability technology. My own particular work has been about walking, so I'll integrate some of those examples, but I think some of the things I share with you apply to augmented bodies more generally. So disability has been historically associated with shame or negative connotations about a person's character. If we look at the language that's used around disability, I challenge my students every semester to find a word for me where disability isn't used as a metaphor for something negative. So we talk about being crippled by emotion. We talk about being deafened. We talk about being blind to reason. We talk about all of these sorts of ways in which we're using disabled bodies as metaphors for bad things happening. And this exists not just in our language. And if you do have an example of a positive use of disability as a metaphor, I would love to hear it. None of my students have provided any examples of this yet. And disability is also made apparent in the social world's technologies and infrastructures we make and continue to make and remake and shape and imagine and enable. The sort of things we think people need or ought to be like reflect the sorts of things we think about disability. Societies usually have a limited number of frames for thinking through disabled bodies. Either disabled bodies are objects of pity or shame, or they're sources of heroism and courage for overcoming their disabilities. Cue the soaring music. Or they're moochers and fakers and people who aren't really disabled if we look at them hard enough. Or they're bitter because they've been disabled in some way. These fictional narratives and entertainment media that feature disabled people often emphasize particular ways of understanding disabled people and what we should do with them, how we should categorize disabled people. And this affects the sort of products we design and how we think about how disabled people ought to be referenced in our technological narratives. So when it comes to engineering for disabilities, people often use the medical model of disabilities, which is to say that they focus on functional impairments, and they see disability as some sort of negative in a person's life. They focus on perceived individual competencies and deficiency, instead of thinking of bodies as being related to social spaces and built environments. This is covered as design in a humanitarian mode. If you're designing for someone who is disabled, you get praised for the work. What you're doing is really good. It's sort of the philanthropic wing of what you're doing. But what this means for individual disabled people who are always seen as objects of pity, shame, as faking, or as one of our other tropes, this becomes more problematic, especially when at a distance from rich groups of users or context. These projects precede user interest altogether. So we have these technologies, well, where should we apply them? And you immediately start thinking of, well, who would benefit? And it becomes disabled people that become seen as objects in our technological projects. Disability studies as an academic field over the past 30 years has started talking, in the past 30 years, about sort of ways in which we can imagine disabilities and where they happen. So the medical model, which I've mentioned briefly, says that disability comes from defects of a person's body or mind. Diagnoses are used then to tell us what's wrong with a person, and then we have to fix that thing. That's the sort of narrative that we get from the medical model. The social model, and there are some variations among the social model, but the social model insists that disability is a social construction. What counts as disabled varies by society and environment, and what sort of work is typical within a particular society. So I think here of how narratives about disability really revolve around who can do factory work, right, and how this came to be. And I think here of who counts as learning disabled depends very much on the educational environments in which we care to put our children. So now that students have to sit for long periods of time and memorize particular amounts of information, we see learning disabilities arise. So the social construction is one that has a historical narrative behind it. There's no reason, actually, that we should think that lots of different types of people with disabilities have anything in common, except that we've been set apart in terms of the workforce, or set apart in terms of social structure, or set apart merely by stigma and bias about the things we can and cannot do. What counts as disability relies on sort of environmental and social norms, this bias in infrastructure, and disability exists only in that interplay. Right? So when I'm in a place that doesn't have a handrail, right, I need assistance to get up to the stairs, but if it existed, you might not even think about my body as being disabled until you witness it. It's in its infrastructure interaction. So disability is always involved in a larger social structure, and it never is an isolated phenomenon. You have theorists like Bill Peace, the disability studies scholar, who talks about his own paralysis and says things like, your typical bipedal person is exposed to a barrage of misleading news stories and led to believe that all paralyzed people share one goal in life, walking. Please cue the music. The flip side of the obsession with walking isn't discussed. No one wants to talk about the gritty reality people who cannot walk are forced to navigate. No one wants to think about the barriers to healthcare and appropriate adaptive technology. Disability must be placed in the larger societal, historical, political, and medical context. It requires these new ways of thinking about disability. So part of the work that I've been working on is talking about norms for sitting and standing and being at eye level, where eye level means people who are standing up with very particular bodies. So particularly people send me lots of images of wheelchairs that stand people up. Well, why would we need wheelchairs that stand people up? Well, things that are at bar height, bar tables, bars, bar seating, tables designed to be standing only, lecterns of standard heights, which if you have any type of achondroplasia or any type of dwarfism could also disable you in your interaction with what you're working with. Reception desks that are high, counter height things, bank tellers counted at airports, schools, and basically all over. And people not looking at wheelchair users as conversational partners. So a common thing for wheelchair users to talk about is how people don't look them in the eye anymore, and whoever they're with gets talked to instead of the person who they should be speaking with. There's also stair climbing wheelchairs why would we need wheelchairs to climb stairs? Because ramps are around the back or blocked or can't be found easily or awkwardly retrofitted, or designers have failed to consider them altogether. Ramps are an easy technology that many people have access to, but why would we need wheelchairs that climb stairs if we have these? I also think exoskeletons fall into this category. Well, we have this sort of technology we could put together. What are we going to do with it? These projects seem to make sense. They make sense because people really like this sort of transhumanist narrative about ascending over our bodies in some way. This one article in the Transhumanist Age, We Should Be Repairing Disabilities, Not Sidewalks, expresses a common sentiment that disabled people encounter that works against our inclusion in the infrastructure. And let's face it, ramps actually allow strollers and people with dollies and heavy packages to use the infrastructure as well. It's never just disabled people that end up benefiting from the disabled architecture we create. And because of course, military applications, it looks very good if we talk about exoskeletons as helping those people instead of as enhancing those other people in a way that will lead to military might and other things that we might be worried about ethically. These things also help in stroke rehab and other things like that, but those aren't the news stories we hear. That's not the mindset we hear about. So these sort of upstanding norms that I've been characterizing are biases ingrained in our social institutions and our design knowledge. It suggests that the answer is that we develop technological fixes to social ignorance and poor and thoughtless environmental designs, to see bodies as projects to be fixed, to see disabled people as objects and not partners in the building of things. It reinforces this medical model of disability over and over when there are social ills and infrastructure issues that could help a much wider variety of people. And it allows us to continue building homes and environments that will become inaccessible as we age and keep disabled people from integrating into public life and to stay in your homes over your course of life. And it reinforces ideas of stigma and difference when we move elderly and disabled people outside of their normal situation in society. And I want to add to this, disability is a normal phenomenon in human life. Everyone, if we're lucky enough to live long enough, will be disabled. It's a normal part of our experiences. So what is it then to work ethically in AI and human augmentation as this panel is supposed to be on? I would say one is to try not to reinforce biases against particular populations, as a lot of technological construction does for disabled bodies, and to consider the larger context in which your tech is deployed. So one of the examples I gave of the wheelchair that goes upstairs, those have been developed, right? Dean Kamen had a patent on the iBot stair climbing wheelchairs, and in fact, disabled people really liked those, right? People with mobility impairments who were wheelchair users actually liked the iBot. However, because of how the infrastructure was set up, meaning Medicare, Medicaid in the United States would not reimburse for an object that was classified not as a mobility device, but as a transportation device. So only people who could afford them, right? Only the very wealthy had any access to the iBot at all. So considering this larger context can actually lead to more success in design, I would suggest. It also helps to work ethically to look at problems that are identified by particular communities. Some of this is happening in maker spaces that are designed for disabled participants, and disabled participants being valued for their expertise instead of being seen as objects that are interesting to study. And to think about flexibility, maintenance, and context of use. Things wear out, especially when you have them on your body at all times. That affects the sorts of ways in which things should be considered, and could consider maintenance and repair as key. To have good technicians to work these things in the field means that people might actually use them over the course of their lives. So here's my information if you want to contact me or offer me grant funding or give me hate mail. Alternatively, you can sock it to me. If you're interested in more reading on this topic, particularly about language, the autistic Hoya has some great things. The Jillian Wise piece appeared in the New York Times fairly recently. Bill Peace's blog, who I quoted from, has the Bad Cripple website, and it's fantastic. Harriet McBride Johnson's memoir, Too Late to Die Young, is fantastic to consider infrastructure issues. And there's a couple of documentaries that are also very instructive on these topics. Thank you.